Hello, everyone, and welcome to our program, Friends with Benefits. This program is sponsored by the Friends of South Shore Health. And as many of you already know, our business is fundraising, friend raising, and community outreach. We offer monthly programs that include educational seminars like this one, book club, lunch bunch, and day trips to special places or events in New England. There's a lot happening with us. And we also raise money for patient care at South Shore Health, a lot of that. Cardiovascular care, home care, pediatrics, cancer care, and anywhere else in our health system, special needs are needed for patients and families. We have an annual scholarship program for our whole system wide for nursing and health related studies. And so these are things that we raise our money for. Our membership fee is only $25 and it doesn't go to us. It goes with everything else. It goes to our programs and our donation plans. So the benefit of being a friend on the other side of it is discounts, meeting new people, uh, gift shop discounts. If you are around the hospital at all, the gift shop is wonderfully stocked with lots of stuff. And outpatient rehab programs, monthly trips, and over 60 area retailers and restaurants that offer discounts for members of the Friends of South Shore Health. We have upcoming programs. Barb, there we are. And in June, we're going to tackle a frequent concern among men and women, urinary tract infections. And while this doesn't sound like fun, it is a very necessary thing, especially the older we get, the more common it becomes. So how to recognize it, how to deal with it, and the side effects of not dealing with it are important too. Following that, pelvic floor exercises for men and women, and these exercises, again, are important to our pelvic muscles that deal with incontinence and a number of things that we face as we get older. In July, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, a wonderful place with a small footprint and a worldwide reach. They do amazing research, and I think you'll find it fascinating to hear all that they offer and the kind of research that they do. In August, mobile phone photography. We have our cameras, we take pictures everywhere. And then we might say, I wish I took better pictures. Well, we'll have a chance to learn how to do that and use our mobile phone in a way that makes really good pictures. So that's what's coming up. And then there'll be a whole bunch of things coming up in the fall. Tonight's speaker is Blake Dinius. He's an entomologist, meaning he deals with bugs. And I've listened to Blake on in-person seminars, and I've loved every one of them. He is a wealth of knowledge about bugs, well, entomology in its broad sense, and especially in this region of the country. He teaches South Shore residents about ticks, pests, pollinators, and how to live with a wide variety of insect life in our area. So Blake, welcome. We're so glad to have you here tonight. So the screen is yours as soon as you share it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Always happy to give these types of presentations for people, and especially about one of my favorite topics, which is pollinators. Tonight we're going to talk about not just pollinators, but maybe the impact that some of our changing climate might have on them.
Mhm.
And it's a very complicated issue, but just let's go ahead and we'll start about talking about kind of the general idea of why we should start caring. So this is a picture right here of a butterfly called an American copper, and it's not really known to be a specific pollinator for many different types of plants we have in the area. It probably does incidentally pollinate some things, but nothing's reliant on this butterfly. But with insects, they always face this obstacle, and it's unlike pretty much any other animal or even plant that I've ever come across. And that's this question of what does it do for me? A lot of people will ask this when I'm presented with almost any insect. People want to know what it does for them. They want to know, is this a pest? Is this something that is going to feed birds? Is it going to decompose leaf material? Does a plant depend on it? So, unlike other animals, insects first need to justify their existence before we start to care about them. We don't really ask this question when it comes to cardinals, hummingbirds, blue jays. We don't ask this question when it comes to dogs or almost virtually any other animal. But with insects, we face this barrier. And unfortunately, sometimes on the other end of things, if I can't give a good enough answer, most people's response is to kill that insect, which if you could imagine someone killing any other animal, if you couldn't respond, oh, it does something good for me. So insects are faced with that huge, huge challenge, right? There are a number of people that do care about pollinators and that do start caring about insects, and they can sometimes care very passionately about insects. But the question I have too is, what is it we're actually fighting for? Because in general, a lot of people, when they're marching in parades like this, or when they're advocating for pollinators, again, they're bringing up specific of what we call ecosystem services. They talk about things like pollinators providing food. There's this famous quote: "One in every 3 bites of food comes from pollinators." That's not entirely accurate. There's a flawed statement, but people love talking about it because it does generate a lot of hype, right? But my question is, shouldn't existence be enough? Like when you look at this red spotted purple butterfly, just having it exist in the world, to me, that should be enough. That should be all the reason it needs to have a spot in this world. And I think getting towards that philosophy, that way of thinking, is the ultimate goal when it comes to conservation, that these things don't need to justify their existence. Now, I know when it comes to grant writing and fundraising that sometimes you need to bring up, oh, this causes this needs this. But the ultimate goal at the very end of the day should be, we're preserving things intact because they just deserve to be there, right? They've been on this planet for millions of years. Who are we to come along in the past, tens of thousands of years and try to wipe them out, right? When it comes to pollinators, it's a very broad topic of insects and other animals. And they come in many, many different shapes and sizes. This is a Zabulon skipper that I found in my own backyard. Super fuzzy, super cute. Um, they can look very different. This is the smallest bee that we have here in North America, on top of the largest bee that we have in North America. And you can just see the variation in size just among bees. Bees also look like this, which a lot of people will call, some people think of as flying ants or wasps. This is a small carpenter bee in the genus Ceratina. This is another bee. This is called a sweat bee. It's pure green sweat bee. Wasps can be pollinators as well. You can see some pollen granules on the back of this wasp here. Ants can be pollinators. Even mosquitoes can be pollinators. And if you were paying attention to the photos, you might notice this mosquito has more pollen on it than any other picture that I've shown thus far. They can be very, very good pollinators. All mosquitoes, including females, cannot survive without nectar. They must take nectar, which means they are visiting flowers. Butterflies, we love butterflies, but they're not always the best pollinators. They pollinate a little bit, but they're pretty to look at, right? What you can see from this particular graph is that most crop pollination is conducted by bees. And the majority of that is conducted by honeybees. That honeybees, a single species that is not native to our continent, is taking care of the majority of pollination services when it comes to crops, right? But then non-bees also make up a very large fraction as well, that if we were to lose any one of these chunks, we would probably be hurting pretty badly, even though the single species of honeybees is really kind of the workforce. But going back to the variety of pollinators, we have over 20,000 bees worldwide, 4,000 to 5,000 bees in North America alone. In just Massachusetts, we have an estimated 350 to 400 species of bees in Massachusetts. We have over 100 butterflies in Massachusetts. And there are an estimated over 1 million undiscovered insects left in the world today. Some scientists even estimate there may be as many as 30 million undiscovered insects in the world today. Many of these pollinators have cryptic life stages. So even though we're aware that these pollinators exist, some of them are hidden out of sight. Like when you look at this blue orchard bee, very small bee, very difficult to find, and it spends most of its life nesting inside stems, which you can see at the bottom on this bottom photo down here, where this female bee has constructed these chambers and she's basically sequestered it with a bit of pollen and some of her, basically she's chewed it up and kind of sequestered, mixed it with some nectar and basically laid a single egg on that and capped it off and done that again and again and again. And that's where it will develop for most of the year. Because most pollinators have a seasonality. This is a frosted elfin, and this frosted elfin is active for only about 3 to 4 weeks out of the entire year. And the image I have here is bearberry or kinnikinick, a fantastic ground cover native plant, and it blooms right around the same time as this frosted elfin. But I like to highlight this because this is the most visible life stage that you are going to see for a frosted elfin. It's still a very small life stage, but you're only going to see it for these 3 to 4 weeks. Following that time period, the eggs will hatch and they will become larvae. And you can see this larva right here on the top left, almost looks like a slug, a green slug, feeding on its host plant, which is wild indigo. And it will feed on that host plant for about a month. But this is very, very difficult to see. And some people believe that they only actually feed at night. So you're looking for a green caterpillar, the color of leaves and stems at night, right? That is very, very small, very cryptic, very hard to find. And then the rest of the time, it's as a pupa, which is either underground or very close to the ground, the color of dirt. So the pollinators, they spend most of their time hidden out of sight. And I want to take a minute to really impress that upon you, because what it means is that even though you're not seeing these organisms, they're out there in the environment. And how you treat that environment, whether or not a bee is flying or whether or not a butterfly is flying, makes a difference, right? You don't want to just do no spraying during the time that the bees are flying, or no spraying during the time that the butterflies are flying, because you want to think about how that spray is going to impact all the organisms close to the ground, on the stems and the leaves, anything that you're doing. If you have if you till in your garden, all that tilling can disrupt any of these bees and butterflies that are developing and nesting underground. And that's part of the purpose of tilling, is to destroy some of these. So you might want to think about where you're tilling and how you're tilling, and be a little bit more judicious about that. Over 3/4 of bees that we have here in North America are solitary, and about 64 to 80% of them nest underground, kind of going along with that same theme about that particular butterfly, which is an endangered, protected species. Going along with that butterfly species nesting, developing very close to the ground or underground, many bees do as well. And even bumblebees, which are a social bee, have a solitary phase. Like many social bees and wasps, the only individual that spends the winter is the queen, the developing queen. Now, the interesting thing about the queens is that most pollinator research focuses on the summer, the spring and the summer, and meadow type habitats. So there's a lot of literature discussing the benefits of pollinator gardens, but there is a dearth of literature, a dearth of research. It's just, there's virtually very little research discussing what happens to the queens during the winter time. And my argument is that that is the most fragile and most important life stage, because what happens to that queen in the winter dictates what happens to the entire colony the next year. Whether or not she survives and whether or not she makes it determines whether or not she generates hundreds of bees that next year. And what we're noticing is that most of these queens nest in and around forested habitat, not meadows, not pollinator gardens, but intact, contiguous stretches of forest. So in this study, for instance, 80% of early season pollen loads on this bumblebee species were from tree pollen. Some bumblebee species even complete most of their life cycles in and around forests, including specializing on canopy and understory. Queen abundance has been correlated with nearby forests, and bumblebee density is associated with greater forested habitat. And then I like this at the bottom too, that 57% of observed bees were feeding on willow in the springtime. So willow is incredibly important as an early spring season resource. I know there's this big push towards no mow May, but to be perfectly honest, I'm not a big supporter of that. Most of the flowers that I have in my backyard they come up when I don't mow, are non-native invasive species, things like creeping Charlie, dandelions, and there are some things in uh, the bittercress, hairy bittercress, and all these things. There are some pollinators that will go to that, but not a heck of a lot. What you really want to do is be supporting native intact landscapes and including things like tree pollen and willow pollen in and around your landscapes. However, 78 or roughly 80% of native flowers in North America need native pollinators. And you might have seen this number a bit higher. Sometimes people say 85%. It really depends on what geographic location you're looking at. And when we're talking about North America, it's about 78%. But this is not something that's necessarily going to generate a grant or something that people are going to care about. They could be flowers that people don't really give a toss about. Some flowers, some like maybe some spring ephemerals or some very small flowers that really don't generate a heck of a lot of money. But for me, they're important because once again, existence should be enough. Flowering, the signals between flowers and pollinators is very, very important, and they've developed over millions and millions of years. Things like the visual, the color, the shape, all these things. If you imagine yourself as a small bee navigating an all green landscape, looking out into that landscape, seeing the sea of green and not knowing where to go, and all of a sudden this thing strikes your eye. It's brilliant, it's colorful, it's big. You can even land on, you can feel the heat with some of the receptors in your feet and antennae, right? You can smell everything. It's bombarding you with all this scent. And so you know exactly where to go, where to get your food as you're flying through that landscape. Many flowers even have what we call these nectar guides. And you can see on this painted trillium, it looks like a bullseye. And the term nectar guide is actually a little bit of a misnomer because they don't necessarily guide the pollinator towards the nectar. What they do is they actually manipulate that pollinator around that plant. So what you will notice is flowers with these nectar guides, very often pollinators will land on the petal and not just go straight for the nectar, but walk in circles around that flower, picking up brushing up against all those stamens, brushing up against that sticky stigma, doing all these things before they take that sip of nectar, because these nectar guides are actually they do something neurologically to these pollinators, and they confuse them a little bit, and they don't actually guide them towards their end goal, but they get them to walk around. Many of these nectar guides are invisible to us. Most insects see in the ultraviolet, green, and blue spectrums. When we look at Rudbeckia, for instance, under ultraviolet light, you can see these nectar guides pop in location. And so I want you to think about that too when designing your landscape, and that there may be flowers and there may be certain types of flowers that you may want to plant for your own purpose, but that those flowers might not necessarily be the most attractive or most natural for the pollinators around you. They may not support them the best because there may be signs and cues that are invisible to us, or even electrical signals that flowers and bees exchange. Bees tend to be more positively charged, flowers tend to be more negatively charged. And for a while, we thought that the only reason they did this was so that bees could very efficiently land on flowers and collect pollen. In the same way that if you took a balloon and rubbed it on your head, it might get statically charged and you could pick up confetti that way. But what we know now is that bees can actually detect and remember the electrical charge on certain flowers. And in social bees, they can actually communicate that back to the rest of the hive. And that flowers will actually respond to the electrical pull of bees flying nearby and release a plume of odor as that bee approaches. Because releasing these scents is very costly to the flower. So if you could also imagine being a flower and not being able to move around, being completely reliant on this bee. And when that bee approaches, you have a way of sensing that bee is close by, and you can emit a burst of that scent to overwhelm that bee. So that bee is not confused at all as to where to go to find the nectar in the pollen. Many pollinators specialize on specific plants. This is a picture of the caterpillar of a fritillary butterfly specializing on violets. And now most people don't like to have violets in their garden because they're a lot like my children. They just do what they want, even though you don't want them to do certain. You tell them to stay in one location, and they're just going to go wherever they want. And so I love that about violets. They just kind of grow everywhere. But violets are a very important resource when it comes to pollinators, in particular the fritillaries, which require them as host plants. In the same way that monarchs require milkweed, these fritillaries require violet. Many bee species are also specialists. Here in the northeastern United States, about 61 of our 350 to 400-ish species of bees are specialist bees. This means they only pollinate one genus or one group of flowers. Without that genus or without that group of flowers, you will not be supporting these bees. And this is what a group of bees that have actually started calling America's forgotten bees, because they are very, very frequently left off of flower lists. There are very, very few flower lists that will incorporate flowering plants for these specialist bees. Let's talk about some kind of an interesting transition here with how is climate impacting pollinators, right? And so this is something that, full disclosure, I'm not a climatologist. I am specifically an entomologist, so I know a lot more about bugs than I do know about climate patterns. But what I can talk to you about is what some of the literature is saying on this particular topic. But there are so many unknowns, like climate, air temp, rainfall, solar radiation. All of these things are going to vary across regions, which means that the effects are going to be very specific to a group of organisms and then specific to that particular region. So when you look at something, it might just be, how are they affecting butterflies in just New England? Or maybe even just Massachusetts, or maybe even just a specific type of butterfly in just Massachusetts. And that could vary, from Massachusetts down to Maryland. It could be completely different, right? And then there are direct effects, and those are a little bit easy to kind of draw a conclusion on, like, oh, this is what a direct effect on this insect could be. But it's still very complicated how that might play out in the real world. And then climate very likely has many, many indirect impacts. And there could even just be like the general chaos that climate creates could also impact things. So beyond these indirect effects and direct effects, just the fact that, when we talk about climate change, we talk about maybe the average temperature of the earth heating up 1.5 degrees, So it's like, I believe that was since like the 1800s, it's heated up 1.5 degrees. So that's an average, but what are the extremes? How do these extremes impact pollinators? Because 1.5 degrees is not that much when you think about it, right? But what matters is how much that impacts the extremes and how much overall that can make a difference, right? But again, the kind of caveat is a lot of this is going to come from studies or modeling, or it's going to focus on a small number of taxa, right? So it's very confusing. Let's start off with this kind of this thing that's come up, right? Because insects are you can call them cold-blooded, right? They're not truly cold-blooded. They're what we call poikilotherms, but in generally, they're going to be dependent on the temperature of their environment, right? But there are some very potential positive effects, especially living here in New England. There could be many positive effects on pollinators. For instance, like this butterfly, this is a clouded sulfur. This has 3 to 5 generations depending on latitude, or what we know now depending on latitude. So as climate increases, we could actually see more of these butterfly populations. Like there's a very big difference in the population size on the 5th generation versus the 3rd generation. So you can see many, many butterflies if that were to go along that same course. For a lot of insects, the most fragile, we talked about the queens, the most fragile life stage is going to be the winter life stage. And having a warmer winter could possibly mean that you have higher winter survival, right? So, and then there are many, many pollinators that are operating under their quote maximum performance. So as you increase temperature, pollinators are going to become more active. They're going to pollinate more. They're going to reproduce more. They're going to breed faster. They're just going to be generally quicker, right? And many pollinators in our area are not operating at their maximum quickness, right? Their maximum efficiency. So as we see temperature increases, we could see this increase in performance amongst pollinators, pollinating plants, increasing the number of pollinators that we see, but up to a point, right? Up to a point, right? Because eventually you're going to reach heat and drought stress, and that's going to really tax these insects. And it can be things like oxidative damage. It's going to impact their proteins. It can cause even their nervous system to shut down. And what we find too with insects is that insects, even amongst clones of insects, you can find variation in how well they survive under cold temperatures, right? So there's a lot of variation depending on can they survive this cold or lower or lower or lower. There's a lot of variation. But when it comes to the upper level, what is the max temperature that an insect can survive at? There is very little room for variation. And in fact, amongst most insects, it's around the same temp. You reach around 41 degrees or so, and many, many insects will not be able to survive. So there is that upper lethal temp that just doesn't, no matter how many times they reproduce or how much genetic variation there is, they can't seem to overcome a very high lethal temperature. So that is going to be a death sentence, right? Over time, there is this kind of idea that perhaps insects may be able to adapt. But what some scientists believe is that might lead to generations of smaller sized insects. And that has implications for morphology. So like certain insects fit into flowers a certain way, right? So the lady slipper, for instance, we believe can only be pollinated by bees of a certain size, bumblebees. What if those bumblebees are now much smaller? Will they be able to fit between the petals of that lady slipper and be able to pollinate that lady slipper the same way? We don't actually know, but that's a question that I think should be asked and should be raised. As far as I know, there has been no studies conducted on that specific question. Eusocial bees, like your honeybees and like your bumblebees, they may be able to regulate nest temps, so they may be a little bit more resilient. But many, many pollinators are solitary. As we talked about earlier, about 80-ish% of native bees are solitary. Rising sea levels, right? So I know this is a picture of a mosquito, but mosquitoes are pollinators, and this is a salt marsh mosquito. So there aren't a heck of a lot of bees and butterflies that I know of associated with salt marsh habitat, which is why I'm using this example. But when we have rising sea levels, it's going to impact species associated with things like salt marsh habitat. Extreme weather events can be very detrimental to pollinator plant interactions, but it really depends on the hazard. And what you're going to see here, and this might be a little hard to see from this diagram, is that things like fire can actually increase the abundance of certain species, but it does decrease it. And so what you have on the photo on the left is the impact on pollinators, and the photo on the right, that's the chart on the right, is the impact on plants. And you can see in both cases, fire seems to increase abundance and sometimes richness, which is the number of species in a given area. And even things like reproductive success of certain flower species. So fire can be helpful. Even like some hurricane events can be helpful, which is kind of might be a little bit confusing in that they shake things up. But it really, what about the frequency of these events, the severity of the events, all these different things could make a big difference. And in general, most of these are not going to be good. Volcano is probably going to do pollinators no favors. What climate can also do is shift the available nutrients found within plants. We know, for instance, especially for insects that feed on plants, like caterpillars, for instance, that plant material can often become less nutritious in the presence of warming climate. So when plants grow faster, when there's a lot more CO2 in the environment, when temperatures are warmer, when they're wetter, plants grow a lot quicker. And what we're finding is they're absorbing much fewer of these nutrients. And so they're almost, the pound for pound, they're becoming less nutritious for the insects that feed on them. And we've seen reductions in grasshoppers in the Midwest, for instance, because of this, because of warming climates have been linked to warming climates. I know of a few scientists working on the impact of this on caterpillars, but it's been a little bit more murky in that regard. But they believe it's there. It's just maybe some of their methods are not sensitive enough to detect these small changes. But it's definitely possible that what you'll be seeing is that even though you may be seeing more plant material growing quicker, like from that last diagram, right? That it may be less nutritious to the given organism, and that could impact, they could completely cascade and impact a number of different things. You get fewer pollinators, and then you get fewer pollinators pollinating plants. It could be pretty bad, right? Changes to flowers in the environment, right? We've seen climate impact the number of flowers decreasing, right? It could alter the availability of nectar, like you can see in this chart on the right, that the nectar volume per flower goes down, right? The sugar concentration goes up, but that a higher sugar concentration might actually be too sticky or too viscous, too syrupy for the pollinators to actually digest properly. It can change the lipid content. And we know that some pollinators are dependent on specific lipids and the balance of these lipids for survival. Many of our specialist bees, for instance, require the specific balance found within specific types of pollen in order to survive. And if you were to change that, they may not be able to survive. And even just the temperature of the flowers is a cue for certain pollinators to land on specific flowers. That if that flower does not feel right as that pollinator lands, they may not want to go back to that flower. There are these things called phenological mismatches, which is effectively that these pollinators in these plants are emerging at different times than they were used to. So if these pollinators and plants have evolved on this continent for millions of years, and they're in sync with each other, that you might have this desynchronization between the pollinator and the plant, that having a warmer climate may cause the plant, in what we actually found in this study from 2023, it's a preprint, so it's not really gone through peer review yet, or it's not fully published yet. I believe it might be in peer review. And then, so in this particular study, what you're seeing is that they looked at something like 1,500 or 1,400 different plants and insects, right? Different organisms. And they found that over time, the plants were emerging earlier and earlier and much sooner than the pollinators were emerging, creating this gap. The gap might not necessarily be there yet, but it's becoming there if we continue along this trajectory, that they are drifting away from each other, right? And you can see in this, it is an example of birds that would be feeding on caterpillars, but you can see that this hump right here would be that the caterpillars emerge at the time that the eggs hatch and become birds, and that if you warm this and these caterpillars emerge too soon, wouldn't be available for the birds to feed on. And that's an example of a bird and caterpillar interaction, but you might actually see this interaction happen with plants as well. But it's also possible that certain plants and pollinators respond to similar cues or could shift at similar rates. So it's one of those things where most of the research is showing that this doesn't seem to be happening, except for this recent study where it's showing that it does. So a lot to tease apart, and definitely something to chew on. For spatial mismatches, which is that maybe things are moving around, moving north, spreading at different rates. This seems to be something much more common. And this is the idea that maybe plants are moving into new geographic locations, either differently or faster than the pollinators can adapt to, or vice versa. And in this particular case, what you can see here is all of the red represents areas that they mapped out where there would no longer be a match of that particular bee species and that particular plant. So you can see that in 2050 and 2070, there's a heck of a lot of red, and green means there was no change. Blue means that they've increased in they expanded their range, but red means that they've reduced that level of interaction. It's gone down, and so you can see that under some of these schemes, some of these models, you've lost as much as 94% of that interaction has dropped out, which can be pretty intense, right? So that's the spatial mismatch seems to be much more of a concern, because plants and insects, they do differ in dispersal mechanisms. Some of them are dispersed, some plants are dispersed by ants or seeds, or squirrels might carry them, or birds might carry them, but certain bees may only fly a quarter of a mile, and that's it. So they could be much more limited in their capacity to disperse. Non-native plants and climate. What is the effect of these? Like, we have this one species of plant It is sold in some parts of the country. It's called tropical milkweed, Asclepias carasavica. And this functions as an ecological death trap under high temperatures. So what the scientists looked at is that this particular species of milkweed is actually more attractive to pollinators under normal temperatures. But when you heat this milkweed up to an average of about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe, it says the cap, oh, sorry, that should be degrees C, 114.8 degrees F. Sorry, my mistake. I should have changed that to F. That actually becomes that becomes lethal to the caterpillars developing on it. So you're attracting all these monarch butterflies to this particular milkweed, and if you get a heat wave that brings that temp really high, then it will smoke. It will kill all the caterpillars that were feeding on it. And so, are there anything else like that? Are there any other impacts of the non-native plants that we're planting in our environment that do this kind of thing? I'm not sure. But the solution to all of this, it might seem disheartening, right? There's a lot going on. The solution is so simple, right? And I want to give this example, right? So this is a study on bee declines, and it's very simple, like to understand. There's a lot. It might look confusing, but basically, if you look at the black bar, that's the population of bees. That's the abundance of bees in the 1970s. If you look at the light gray bar, that's the population in the early 2000s. So if the black bar is higher and the gray bar is smaller, it means that population went down. If the black bar is lower and the gray bar is higher, that population of bees went up. So we can see for Bombus impatiens that the gray bar went up, so that population is doing incredibly well. But when you look at Bombus fervidus, what I have here, the black bar is higher in the 70s than the gray bar, so that population went way, way down. This is Bombus fervidus, and this bee I found in Marshfield last year in a pollinator garden that someone constructed. So you can support these bees. It can happen. This is something that you can do. But we can start with this, because the American lawn turfgrass doesn't do pollinators virtually any favors. Again, kind of going back to No Mow May, doesn't really matter that much if you don't cut it, or if you cut it, it's not going to do a heck of a lot unless you put some work into it. What we know about many insect declines is that habitat loss and pollution make up the bulk of what are driving these insect declines, right? And we have full control over whether or not we're doing these things, or how we're managing these things in and around our yards, right? We control the habitat in our yard. We can determine how much pesticide, fertilizers, and other pollutants we're putting out into the environment in and around our backyards, assuming we don't live in any of these homeowners associations and things like that that might have more control over that. This might be more of like the new way of thinking. And you can go further than this, you can go less than this. It's going to be about what you find is your own comfort zone. Like I know that some people on this call, I have 2 kids at home. So I need to reserve some of this property for areas that we're going to actively use. So I do keep those parts of the area. I try to maintain those areas, keep that grass cut, keep some of that lawn. But I don't need my full 1.25 acres dedicated to just lawn, right? So a lot of that is dedicated to bringing back some of these native landscapes, bringing back these native flowers, right? These are some photos I have of native flowers from my own backyard. I've got some high bush blueberry, I've got some chokeberry, I've got some black gum, I've got a number of different native plants. And right now what we have blooming, and we've got starflower, we've got Canada Mayflower, we've got cinquefoils everywhere. I've got lance leaf violets, I've got sessile bellworts. I have so many native plants that every time I go out there, I seem like I find a new native plant in my own backyard. And in addition, you can even add on to native plants that might be growing in that area too. Like I've got some cardinal flowers, I got some bee balm, I've got some swamp milkweeds that I brought in. I have plenty of goldenrod, asters. I love those. It's important to stick with native plants and non-cultivars. I mean, how do we think that our pollinators are going to react to a non-native plant or a cultivar? Who here was mad when they went ahead and they changed all of the exit numbers driving up and down Route 3 or many other highways, right? We're pretty frustrated. It's like, and this is just an exit number, right? And it's not something we've evolved alongside of for millions of years, right? But if you can imagine, if we change the color of those exit signs, if we change the shape of those exit signs, how mad would people be? So think about, you're a pollinator, you're used to the way a flower looks, the way it smells, the way it feels, and now we've changed the color and the shape, right? You've been used to this for millions of years, and now it's changed on a whim, right? The thing I added this slide because we're on the topic of climate change. So what is native now is not necessarily what's going to be native later. So I want you to start thinking about what's going to be native later, right? And welcoming that stuff into your yard. So we are basically faced with two options, right? The first option is we can stop climate change. The second option, and I don't think that's I think human beings have kind of demonstrated that that's not necessarily going to happen right now. And so your second option is the stuff that is moving up into your backyard. You need to welcome that, because if you stop that from coming into your backyard, you are shrinking the available space that that particular organism has to move up, right? So it's very, very important that you anticipate these expanding northward ranges and you accommodate those particular pollinators or those particular plants. So the term that I think best describes this is managed relocation, right? We're actively doing something and it's relocation. It's not migration, it's a relocation. These things are being relocated, right? The image I have is of a red-banded hairstreak. So this is historically thought of as a southern species of butterfly, and in like the 2010s, people were finding it, and it was really rare. It was very uncommon, and now it's like a pretty common sight to see. You can kind of go around and you can find this, and it's become very, very common now. Um, Still fun to see, but it's not something that we would consider like an amazing, crazy, rare butterfly. The next thing is you always want a variety of plants in your backyard. Plants and pollinators operate in what we call nested networks. It's nested. If you think about like the Russian nesting dolls that fit inside each other, that's kind of the way these pollinator networks work. Is you have one network and then a smaller network that operates inside that, and a smaller one that operates inside that, and a smaller one that operates inside that. So we can see here, for instance, is you've got the dark green flower and then the dark green bee. They provide the dark green flower provides food for many different bees, and the dark green bee pollinates many different flowers. But then you have smaller networks within that. And what we find is that this probably exists because it creates stability and resiliency in the environment. But so a natural ecosystem is going to be highly nested, a native, untouched, conserved piece of property. But what we find is that this nestedness declines pretty greatly with increasing human land use. And what you can see from this particular study is that a typical suburban area is no more nested than an urban environment, which means that you may have more flowers in your backyard, but when it comes to these intricate overlaying pollinator networks, that it's the same as maybe an area like Boston Common, right? Which means that if you get one heat wave, if you get any of these adverse weather events, that might cause a much larger disruption in those pollinator networks that you have in your own backyard. So it's really important that you add on to that. And I know if you're a group of gardeners, you might not need someone telling you to buy more flowers, but if you need an excuse to tell your partners why you have more flowers, tell them that Blake Denny has told you are saving the world, and he's an entomologist, and this is verified by scientific data. If you're overwhelmed and you want to pick a starting point, these are some good starting points. But like I said, many of our solitary bees are left off of flower lists. Like if you combine the flower lists of both Xerces Society and Native Plant Trust, you will find it misses about half, about 30 of those 61 solitary bee species, right? Even planting every single plant from both of those lists still miss 30. That's why they're forgotten bees, because they're very, very frequently left off of these flower lists. So start with them, but they're not an end goal. They're not a baking recipe. They're a starting point to get you going, right? Because a lot of this can be very overwhelming. I like this study. It's what I've been calling set and forget plants. In this particular study in Ohio, they looked at degraded strip mines over a 10-year period. And this means, so basically they walked into this area. There were no plants. They're degraded, like hellish landscapes. And they said, we're going to throw down these seed mixes and do no maintenance. So no mowing, no weeding, no fertilizer, no tilling, none of these things, and just see what happens, right? And, long story short, what they found is that after 10 years, some of the plants still stuck around. And the ones on the bottom right here, these are the plants that persisted, right? The ones that I have bolded are plants that are native to Massachusetts. Again, we're looking at Ohio, so not all of these are going to be native to Massachusetts, but the ones that are bolded are native to Massachusetts. So if you are considering throwing down some plants in an area that you don't want to put a lot of work into, maybe consider starting with these. I don't necessarily know if they're going to last the same as they did in Ohio, but we don't have that data for Massachusetts. We have it for Ohio, right? And then the others that are not native, Rudbeckia, that's your black-eyed Susans, your brown-eyed Susans. Helianthus, that's your sunflowers. So you might even be able to find an alternative, like a native species of those genera that you could be growing in these areas. Could be useful for some of the rotaries. It could be used for places that just don't get a heck of a lot of attention. It could be useful for daycares or any of these places. Just throw them down and see exactly what happens. Location of your pollinator garden can matter quite a bit. I like this particular photo because what these people have done is they've located many of these plants up and away from the edge of forests. One of the things that comes up a lot is that people tell me that they're not doing a yard spray, but their neighbors are. And you don't necessarily know what that applicator is doing when they go and spray your neighbor's yard, right? They're not supposed to spray to get drift into your yard, but it could happen. So when you design your pollinator garden, consider that your neighbors may be spraying and design your pollinator garden away from any areas that could be sprayed even by drift. That's I think to me that's important, right? Many of these pollinators nest in stems, so it's important that when you're doing any of your fall cleanup or even early spring cleanup, that you leave your pithy stems and sticks, raspberry, rose, sumac. What we find is that the natural structure of these stems is highly beneficial, and that these natural plants contain very important cues. So pollinator, what they call like pollinator hotels or bee hotels, do not have that. And that many of these are not exactly helpful to pollinators. Even when you do them the proper way, they're still not really as good as the real thing. But if you did want to build this bee hotel or this pollinator hotel the right way, what you want are these sets of criteria. You need chambers that are replaceable or cleanable. And this is to help reduce disease. They need to be about 6 inches long or 6 inches deep, because we know that bees can actually control the sex of their offspring, and they tend to lay their females, the females toward the back and the males towards the front. And when you have a tube that is shorter than 6 inches, what that can do is skew the sex ratio in a way that generates a greater male to female ratio, and that you have fewer females in that next generation, which might mean you have a smaller population of bees that next generation as well. You want to shield it from sun, direct sun and rain, varied size holes for varied different types of bees. And again, it's still not nearly as good as the real thing. The real thing is the best thing you can do, right? It's important to leave the leaves. There are many organisms that survive the winter using leaves. This is a picture of fireflies. They're not necessarily the best pollinators, but I do like them because I feel like they're one of the poster child for conservation. And many plants, many of our spring ephemerals actually require leaves breaking down naturally in the environment. They require this thick layer of duff to kind of build up in the environment. That layer is going to be very insulative. It's going to actually work as a sieve too, as the water kind of comes down. It's going to create this. It's not going to be spongy and soak up that water. It's going to allow that water to come down. It's going to be oxygenated. All those conditions are very, very important for both plants and organisms. And this is a study on ticks, but ticks are a native organism that you will be supporting with leaving the leaves. So just to kind of just to kind of throw that cautionary advice out there, be careful if you're leaving the leaves. It's a good thing to do, but definitely be careful. But what we can find is how much insulation these leaves are providing. It's a difference of almost 40 degrees between the temperature underneath leaves and snow and the ambient air temperature. So when you think about how cold it can get, right? And we might have warming, when it comes to like warming temps, climate change and warming temps, it might not matter as much. But if the temps do drop very low, like -9 degrees Fahrenheit, many of your pollinators are going to be fine underneath the leaves that you provided last fall. Important to reduce light pollution. We're finding that light pollution is maybe as much, if not more, detrimental to many of our pollinators, especially the night flying insects that rely on pitch black in order to survive, in order to breed, including things like fireflies, right? And this is what you can be able to see the blinks here, but this is a location that is completely protected, and you can see all of the fireflies. Many people will ask me, where the fireflies gone? They're here. You just need to let them exist. Um, and at this point, I'll take any questions that people might have on any topics that we've covered, pollinators, climate change, and maybe even anything else if they wanted to know.
That is a lot to think about. A lot. Given that humanity does what it does, they want it to look good, they want lights, they want upward beaming lights, they want pretty flowers that will go in a range of something all season long. The whole idea of how do you plant a garden, this is why you go to someone who understands pollinator gardens and the importance of duff and things like that. So much I didn't know, and so much wrong that I'm doing, I'm almost embarrassed, when thinking about how, because I didn't know. And the finding the balance is a big one. Bob Marks, is this a lot of new information for you? Turn your speaker on.
Yes, but much of what he covered has been covered in this, uh, thing that I do on Tuesday nights.
Right, right.
The big thing, and the big thing I was hoping he would say it was that when you cut down your garden, in the fall, you
Mhm.
should never cut it down ground level. You should leave the stalks to 6 or 8 inches high because the pollinators use them to nest in.
Blake, do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I'll go back to that slide. Yeah, right here, right here. Yeah, in this particular case, they have cut the stems. I think just leaving the stems completely intact. I don't cut the stems at all. I'd recommend not cutting them ever. Sometimes people ask me what is the best time to cut them, and the best practice is to not cut them. You always want to just leave them. So yeah, I mean, there's not much more to say on that topic other than that a lot of insects will use these.
What about trees? Do insects
Yes.
do the bark of trees? Is that important for them?
Yes, and there's a whole ecology built around even things what they call snags, which are standing dead trees. So a lot of times people will see a dead tree and they'll think, and it could be a hazard, right? It could be a hazard, a safety hazard. But
Mhm.
that standing dead tree actually provides habitat and food for different organisms than if you were to cut that and have a fallen log. So when you cut that standing snag and it topples over and ends up as a wood on the ground, is going to provide a different benefit than if you leave that snag intact with all of its bark around there. There's a whole group of organisms that use just the snags of trees. So there's insects that are going to, several insects will spend the winter under bark. Um, including some of the things that we don't like some of the stink bugs and some of the and moths. There are moths that will overwinter on. They will spend. Those kind of go underneath bark. Um, but the pithy stems are really important for, in this context, pollinators, specifically the cavity nesting bees that use those. And there are some. The other thing about these stems that I didn't say is that some bees will hollow out the stem, and then there are other bees that cannot do that and rely on either a stem to be naturally pithy and naturally have that, or to have or another organism comes along and hollows that out and then leaves, and then the other bee will go and nest in that cavity that's already pre-made. So again, one of the reasons why you don't want to just get rid of the stems or cut them down is that a used stem could then be used again for one of these other pollinators that might not be able to hollow that out on their own.
In an urban landscape, when a tree has to come down because it's going to potentially fall, is it better to leave some of the stump there? Is it better to leave some bark on the ground? Things like that.
With all of these suggestions, and I guess that's the proper way to call them, is suggestions, because they're not cardinal rules or anything. What you're going to find is that the decision to do any of these is going to vary from person to person and from organization to organization, whether it's going to be a decision that gets made on a case by case basis, right? So just recently, me and my family, we had some snags cut down in my yard. They were they were a serious concern. You know, we've got the kids. They were trees very close to our house. So we went ahead and we made that decision to get those snags cut down, even though I know full well that we're probably providing some type of habitat for certain things. It was just that decision that we made because we don't want to die. You know, we don't want something to fall on our house. So these are going to be the kinds of decisions that people are going to make. But when available, you do want to leave these around, right? And the same kind of goes for any of these pithy stems, right? So if you have some in your backyard, you can start leaving them. But maybe they're in a location that you can't. Like maybe you're about to sell your home and you want to get the max price for your home. Like you might want to clean these up. So it's going to be, again, a very personal decision between each individual. And that threshold is going to vary from person to person. Like I once spoke to a garden club and there was a gentleman there. He's really nice. I have nothing bad to say about him, but he just doesn't like native plants. And so it was a big thing for me to get him to say, like, okay, I'm going to leave a little bit of milkweed this year or a little bit of goldenrod. Those are weeds to him, but he did a little bit. And and to me, that's a victory. Even though he's not doing nearly as much as I am or nearly as much as some other people I know, to me, that's more than he was doing before. And that's what it's going to take is each individual person doing a little bit more. And the same way that if you go to church and they pass the donations around, right? You pass and everyone gives what they can. Some people can give $1. Some people can give $50. Some people can give 100, right? It's going to vary from person to person. So what you give back to pollinators in and around your landscape is going to vary based on what you have available to give. And so with pithy stems, with leaving the leaves, with snags, with bark, with any of these things, with the letting the duff build up, all of these things are going to vary based on the scenario. If you are managing a daycare or if you're running a senior center, you may not be able to leave as much around, but it's possible that you could. Good night, honey. Yeah, playing baby. Sounds good. And so, yeah, I mean, I would love to say what the best practice is, but to be perfectly honest, your best practice, the ultimate best practice is that all of us bulldoze our homes and donate the land to conservation and we all move into a pod hotel together and we just stay there. Because even just the plot of land that your house is built up on is taking up space that could be pollinator habitat. So you're going to find that happy medium somewhere. And it's going to be, you don't always have to feel bad. Like I think you opened with, you might be a little bit embarrassed about some of the decisions you've made. Well, that kind of embarrassment is something that I've gotten used to because what we're going to realize is that even over time, more and more, we're going to find that research is going to advise us on things that we're doing in the future that we didn't know at the time we started these things. I might have another slide over here. Oh, if I move up. Yeah, here. So flower arrangement here might actually matter. And I've never seen a pollinator garden design like this, but what they found in this study is that there were 2.5 to 4 times more eggs found on the arrangement A than any arrangement B or C. And what arrangement A is they put milkweed in a border, in a perimeter, where they space the plants 1 meter apart. No, sorry, half a meter apart, and then 1 meter between the plants and the center of wild flowers. So it was almost like a donut of milkweed. And they found 2.5 to 4 times more eggs and caterpillars. So if you're thinking about designing a pollinator garden and supporting monarchs, this is something you might want to do. But I've never seen a monarch habitat built like that. This is another example. That Serratina bees, small bees, tend to visit isolated flowers, and large bees tend to visit dense patches of flowers. So like in the picture below, this is a perfect bumblebee flower garden, but it is not a good flower garden for small native bees. So they're not gonna want to visit this. And so how you design your pollinator garden, we just learned this in 2021. So if you started your pollinator garden before then, it's okay. Like it might have been done, I don't want to say the wrong way, but it was done to the best of your ability at that time with the knowledge you had at that time. And now we have more knowledge, so we can do something different and we can do something better going forward.
Laura, Mary, Bob, do you have questions? Well, then I'll keep asking. You didn't talk much about wasps, and do they follow a similar pattern to bees in terms of queens and winter layover and those sorts of things?
It depends on the wasp. We believe that wasps, when people say wasp, what they're generally talking about are yellow jackets and the paper wasps. They're not necessarily talking about the parasitic wasps, the ones that parasitize and control other pest insects. Like when you see a tomato hornworm and it's covered in those almost look like white tic tacs growing out of the back of a tomato hornworm or tobacco hornworm, that those are actually developing parasitic wasps. The social wasps, like your paper wasp and like your yellow jacket, they do have the similar annual life cycle as the bumblebee, where the queen overwinters. In the European hornet and the bald-faced hornet, they do the same thing. The bald-faced hornet is really just a yellow jacket, even though it's white and black. And so they do the same thing. But your other wasps, your parasitic wasps, are different in that they can have very, very quick generation times because they're parasitizing on a given resource. So they're not engaging in this whole kind of social annual life cycle like that. And butterfly species are similar too, where some of them have that annual life cycle, but there are the ones that are associated with resources like legumes or like some herb type plants. Those butterflies tend to have many generations in a given season because they're capitalizing on a very ephemeral resource, and a resource that can quickly grow and quickly replenish. So those butterflies may have many generations versus some butterflies that are not looking to capitalize on that may have only a single generation.
So bats and other creatures, let's say, that feed on insects are impacted just as much, right? If the cycles are off and between the plant and the insect that eats it, what's happening to the insect eaters?
What's happening to the you're asking, the question was about bats and insects that might feed on bats, or
No,
bats that might feed on insects?
no, it's more like bats feed on insects, right?
Yes.
So as insect populations diminish, what are bats feeding on?
It's a good question.
Do you,
That's a good
I
question.
mean, it's not an insect question, but I wondered if you had some input on that. Because bat populations are important too, right?
Yeah. It's kind of funny too, because you look online and what you find is that most people try to justify the existence of bats saying they feed on insects. And I think bats are just cool because they're a flying mammal,
Mhm.
a nocturnal flying mammal. That is really, really stinking cool, right? Um, but you're right. I mean, I think that the question kind of answers itself. If bats feeds on insects and the insects are declining, what are the bats feeding on? Nothing.
Mm.
Um, except for the bats that do go to flowers and fruits and things like that.
Mm.
But the bats that we have around here, they're mostly majority of them are feeding on moths and other night flying insects. And so if those are declining due to light pollution, I wouldn't necessarily think that they're declining due to the phenological mismatches or the spatial mismatches, but they're probably declining due to light pollution and maybe some mosquito spraying and things like that. So that that is something that they probably are being impacted, but I'm not someone who studies bats. I would just assume that they would be. If you take away the food of something, it's probably not going
Yeah,
to do too well. Yeah.
yeah. So in summer months, when it doesn't get dark till much later, the time for mating and feeding and all of that is reduced. And for those of us who have dawn to dusk lighting and things like that, yes, that we're lighting up the night for a longer period of time. So I'm taking away one thought is that to look at our lighting schedule and increase more hours of darkness than we now are doing.
You absolutely want to do that. And what we also find too, maybe on the selfish end of things, is that by running a lot of these lights at night, we actually increase biting mosquitoes in and around given area.
Oh,
So
yes, of course.
yeah. So if you want fewer mosquitoes, you actually want more pitch black. You'll find fewer mosquitoes when it's pitch black because mosquitoes like that pale dawn dusk kind of lighting, very like pale lighting, right? Um, so if you're the only one not running your lights, it still may be too much light if your neighbors are running lights. But if everyone in a given neighborhood is turning their lights off, it could be dark enough that the mosquitoes may not be as active during that given time. So it's all of this stuff is going to be a team effort. It's not any one person going to be doing one thing. I I know it's tricky because people want to feel like they're making a huge difference, but when it really comes down to it, that this bees and pollinators are not going to be saved by any one single person. They're going to be saved by this group effort. Most of the bees, they only fly for a quarter of a mile to a third of a mile, which means that you could have the best pollinator garden out there. And if there's nothing connecting your garden to a population of these bees, then that's it. They're not going to have those bees. Same thing with lighting, same thing with flowers, with all these things. It's going to be a group effort. We're going to need to come together. That's why I really try to impress upon people that it's about finding their own personal happy medium. Because what I find is that when you are too aggressive with your messaging, that you either get people who want to help and feel like they can't, and so they just give up and they don't do anything, or they want to help and they just feel so bad about it they never get around to it. So it's better that you start simple and you get people to do what they can and then build on that over time.
So, like when people do, I mean, there are a lot of hobby beekeepers, and that's probably helpful in many respects, but wouldn't be if they don't have the right plants, I assume. So when beekeepers set up, are there guides for what to plant so that you're feeding your bees well?
Beekeepers are tricky. Apis mellifera, the bee, the honeybee, is not a native pollinator, and it's actually been correlated to declines in native bee species. So it's not something that you want to have if you're talking about saving the bees for the sole for the it's really the honeybee and the native pollinators are two different stories. Your honeybee is the most important crop pollinator. Your native bees are a little bit helpful for crops, but not too much. But they require different levels of support. So the honeybee can't really exist without dedicated care. There aren't that many feral colonies. They're really hard to maintain. But your native bees exist with you just want to keep things native in the wild, right?
Mhm.
And so they're a little bit different. What we find is that the honeybees actually will compete with the native bees and sometimes drive those populations down. So if you have hobby beekeepers, they're taking care of what is effectively an invasive species that might actually be harming the ecosystem, even if they're doing it properly. But I don't want to poo-poo beekeepers because we need good beekeepers because we also need food.
Mm.
We need honey, we need food, but what the real thing that we want to avoid at all costs are the hobbyist beekeepers that are not good at what they're doing because they're the ones that are spreading disease and they're also harming the ecosystem around. And then they're not helping with food and they're not helping with honey. They're just causing ecological damage to the environment. So that's the position you want to avoid. And the best way to avoid that, in my opinion, is to go to the Plymouth County Beekeepers Association. They run their beekeeping course and they will train you to become a good beekeeper. And they still lose some hives, but they take what they do seriously and they're very, very good at what they do. At least the beekeepers that I've met are fantastic. Um, and so
Well,
that's
that's a
my
good
recommendation is you
suggestion.
get into beekeeping, you do it the right way, but you're not doing it with the goal of helping the environment. You're doing it with the goal of generating honey, generating wax, maybe pollinating food, and that's it, or just because it's fun.
Can you comment on the Africanized bee, the more aggressive kind of bee that's becoming more common here?
That
Um,
bee, that bee is just a European honeybee. It's a strain of a European honeybee. It's basically so the honeybee has many different subspecies, um, different populations of this bee. And the same way that you have different dog breeds, they're all the same species. A golden retriever is the same species as a poodle, but
mhm.
they're different breeds. And so the quote Africanized bee is just effectively a breed of this bee, and that's it. Um, and what it happens is that it was kind of brought in, and it's found mostly in like the southern parts of the continent, and every now and then it does move up a little bit. But as far as we know, by the time it breeds up into our area, all of any of the aggressive traits are really diluted and bred out by the time it makes its way here. It's not really considered a threat or any real danger, at least to anyone living in this part of the country.
That's good to know. Ticks. So that's a concern among many, many people because we like to walk in the woodlands and our pets like to run with us and our kids like to run and all of that. Thoughts about how to stay safe without the kinds of chemicals that kill them, or do we want to kill them?
There are so if you had the ability to completely control a given landscape or environment, the way you would kind of manage for ticks without chemicals is you would bring back these apex predators to a given area. So things like black bears, things like bobcats, all these typical things, they're going to control a lot of the hosts that kind of enhance disease transmission in and amongst ticks. Um, we unfortunately live in an area that is cut up like a checkerboard, with neighborhoods, shopping centers, all these different locations, just chop up and fragment that landscape. So one of the first things that tends to fall out of that, when you fragment a habitat, one of the first things that falls out are these large apex predators that they just don't survive very well without intact, contiguous open forest, right? Um, So under those circumstances that we can't necessarily do that, what I recommend is focusing first and foremost on personal protection. So not applying chemicals to the landscape, but applying them to clothing and parts of your body. So wearing the correct repellents on your skin when you go out, applying something called permethrin to your clothing so that you're not spraying the environment, you're just applying it to your clothes, the outside of your clothes, that is you're probably not gonna impact anything else except for any ticks that crawl up under your pants, shoes, and socks. And
Mhm.
so that's it. So those are my recommendations. When it comes to spraying chemicals in the landscape, it's not something that I do. It's not something that you have to do, but it's something that I think people ask me about a lot because they want to do. And so I feel obliged to tell them how to do it the right way. But when it comes to a landscape spray, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you and tell you that it's completely unnecessary. It's secondary, it's an additional layer of protection, and it's not something you want to rely on. So it's not even the first thing that you have to do. The major things that you want to do is you focus on your personal protection, the repellents, the permethrin, and then tick checks at the end of the day, and that's it.
Okay. So if somebody were to use a spray in their yard of some sort, what would you suggest?
Okay, if they're going to do a spray, so the big issue with the sprays is they're going to vary based on where you apply the spray, what area of the property it's applied, the time of year it's applied, and what chemical is applied. And when you hire someone, you're giving them $100 to $150 of your money and saying, here, I trust you to do the right thing. I trust you to spray in the right location at the right time with the right stuff.
Mm,
So I don't trust these people. I don't trust a lot of people. And so, but what you want to do, if you were really curious and you wanted to get the spray done the right way, what you want is a synthetic spray. An all natural spray will not work. It's not effective. So there was one that did work. It was called the Eco. What is it? What was it called? It was called the new company. They call it a Century IC3. There was an IC2 that worked, and that was completely taken off the market. It's not available. But the new reformulated product, the Century IC3, does not work better than water.
mm,
Any of the essential oil sprays are about as effective as water. That's what you're having someone spray in your backyard when you have an essential oil spray is effectively water. Um, the synthetic sprays work, but they kill everything.
mm.
So what you want is when they go to spray, you spray very targeted areas where the ticks tend to be, and you avoid everything else. So when they're getting that spray done, what you want that spray to occur, you want it to occur in the perimeter of your yard, like the edge, the very edge, about 5 to 6 feet in that border around your property. And you want them to spray with more of a high pressure spray to get up underneath the leaves and hit that soil, right? And then you spray the first or second week of May and the first or second week of June, just 2 sprays per year, and that's it. Those are the only sprays you need all year long. If they're spraying more than that, they're spraying and they're killing things they don't need to kill. If they're spraying anything besides that perimeter, they're spraying and they're killing things that they don't need to kill. If they're spraying less than that, they're not protecting you.
Okay, that was helpful information. Thank you. All right, Blake, this has been a lot of information, so I'm very glad that we'll have a video to go back and re-examine all of this again. Your slides were wonderful. Did you take some of the pictures yourself?
Oh yeah, a lot of them were taken myself because I I didn't have pictures for all of everything, but what I really like to highlight is just what is possible to find in and around this area if you
Mhm.
do things the right way. I usually try to bring that up at the beginning of the presentation because I want people to know that the stuff does exist around here and that it is possible to find these things and to do the right thing.
I rarely meet someone with a passion for insects that you have, and it's refreshing because it makes me rethink.
Thank you. I
Probably,
appreciate that.
uh,
It's really nice.
I see it as more in the light of how beneficial they are rather than, oh my gosh, there's such pests. So, but thank you very much. I'm sorry we didn't have 1,000 people here with us tonight.
It's all right.
The video will go out to the 40 who registered, and hopefully they will share it with others. And thank you so much for spending the evening with us and preparing a very, very informative program.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Recording off.
Have a good night.
Good night, Blake. Have a good one. And for all of you who are here, we wish you the best of evening.